Hello, everyone, and welcome to Trust But Verify, Maintaining Democracy in Spite of Information Countermeasures. My name is Allie Mellon. I'm a security strategist in the office of the CSO at Cyberreason. I have been in tech for about a decade now, and I've spent 5 of those years as a mobile app developer and engineer, and the past several working in the security space. And for the last 2 years, I've been working closely with the FBI, Secret Service, DHS, and local and state law enforcement to help protect our elections. One of the things that we've been doing in order to really identify the processes in place that the government has to protect our elections is to go through tabletop election security exercises. In these exercises, it's hackers versus law enforcement and government officials to really figure out whether or not the government is prepared and has the processes in place to handle different things that attackers might try to do. This does not require any hacking of actual voting machines or any actual hands-on keyboard hacking. It's really all about seeing the processes in place and really making sure that government officials and law enforcement are prepared for any scenario. But before we really dive into that portion of the talk, I want to start by talking about what's truly critical to our daily lives, because this is really more connected to making sure our vote is secure than you might think. The way that I think about this is through Maslow's hierarchy of needs. For those of you who don't know what this is a pyramid that really talks about all of the things that we as human beings need before we feel comfortable reaching and becoming the best that we can be. At the base of this pyramid, we see the physiological needs. These are things like air, water, food, shelter, all of the things that we really need just to live. Above that, we have safety. And this layer is really about that personal security, safety with your employment, having the resources that you need to survive. Above that layer, and this one is really critical, is all about belonging. These are things like friendship and intimacy and that sense of connection that you need as a human being. Above that is esteem. This comes in the form of not only self-respect and self-esteem, but also status and recognition within the community that you're a part of. And this is all leading up to the top of the pyramid, which is self-actualization. This is really that desire to be the most that one can be. So where does voting fit into this process? That's what we're going to look to address today and really understand and give a framework for how we should be thinking about voting during an election. Now, I'm going to start by diving into the defender perspective to give you an idea of what's happening today and how this is being approached today. Then we'll talk about the daily life of the actual voters themselves before jumping into the attacker perspective. After that, that will really be the basis to understand what we as individuals might be able to do to stop an election or as nation states. And then we can use that information to really try to protect our elections. Let's jump into the defender perspective, the state of play today. So the DHS defines election security and election infrastructure in particular as things like voter registration databases, IT infrastructure, voting system, polling places, all of the things really needed to tabulate and count the votes. But my question is this really all? And through my work with these organizations, I've really found that this is not all, that we need a much more broad and encompassing definition. And the way that I've been thinking about this is through what I call the voter hierarchy of needs. This is a pyramid, much like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that shows all of the things that we as individuals really need in order to feel comfortable, safe, and willing to go vote. Much like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, this does include physiological needs. If we don't feel like we have the air or the food or the water that we need to survive, we have other priorities that come before voting. Similarly, if we don't feel safe, either in our country, in our homes, at our work, we're much less likely to vote because we need to prioritize that safety before we can prioritize voting. Belonging is also an absolutely critical component. If we don't feel like we belong in the country that we're in, if we don't feel an attachment to that country, people are much less likely to vote. And esteem is also critical. If we don't feel like our vote matters or like we're respected in the community, we're much less likely to want to give back to that community and to make change in that community through voting. And then last but not least, of course, self-actualization comes into play here. Not only about being the best that you as an individual can be, but about being the best that your country can be and helping your country achieve that. So this is what I call the voter hierarchy of needs. And this is one of the reasons why I question if election infrastructure should really be limited to what's used to tabulate and collect votes. Because we have all of these layers that we need to protect in order to ensure the integrity of the vote. And they can all be systems that are a target. And this is especially true when we think about the fact that 40% of eligible US citizens do not vote at all. With numbers as high as these, any kind of voter suppression has an impact on the election, and we need to be cognizant of that. So when I think about election infrastructure and election security, I think about the importance of maintaining faith in democracy, of preventing voter suppression, and of course, of ensuring national security. So with all of that in mind, I really want to dive into the attacker perspective. And I want to make a quick note as you're thinking about this, that this is not an evil thing to do. We are not diving into the attacker perspective so we can hurt anyone or so we can affect any outcomes of any elections. We're doing it so we can get a better understanding of what could go wrong so we can protect against it. This is why we red team in security. It's very important so that we can be the best that we can be. And I don't want for anyone to get the sense that this is something that we're doing vindictively or for an evil outcome. This is purely to make us stronger and to make us better. So let's dive in. When we think about attacker motivations, especially at the nation state level, we're thinking about things like gaining power, spreading a particular ideology, or maintaining global recognition and support. All three of these things are really critical for different nation states, whether they are currently superpowers, whether they want to be superpowers, or whether they're just trying to ensure their survival. I want to talk about the different layers that a cyber attack can target. Because more generally, outside of elections, but also specifically for elections, I see cyber attacks affecting three core layers. There's the infrastructure layer. That is all about the physical aspects of a system. So it's about taking a cyber attack and having it affect the kinetic world. The second is information. This is actually about spreading information that isn't true, but making people believe that it's fact. And then ethos, which is of course about that belief system, really targeting and affecting that belief system to influence an outcome. And now I want to really dive into a lot of examples of attacks on elections and on governments that relate to these three planes. We're going to show some historical ones that don't really have a cyber component, but could very easily be translated to have one. And so as we're going through these, I want you to think about how cyber could be used to actually make this even more potent than it already was. We'll also be looking at some modern examples that do include a cyber component to give a little variety and show how this is really happening already today. I want to start with the Italian elections of 1948. This was election interference in 1948, where the US government was actually intent on psychological warfare. Of course, it was right after World War II, a very tense time, and millions of dollars was going to Christian Democratic and right-wing socialist parties to sway the outcome of this election. It was really a massive propaganda campaign against the Communist Socialist Coalition, and the goal on both sides was to really change the perception of the election. It was about democracy versus totalitarianism, Christianity versus atheism, really abundance versus starvation, and ultimately America versus the Soviet Union. And the outcome was so effective that the US repeated this process in Guatemala, in South Vietnam, in Afghanistan, and Indonesia, and many, many more countries. Another example I want to showcase is the 1996 Chinese influence on the US election. In 1996, $300,000 was funneled from a Chinese general interested in influencing the US presidential election to the Clinton campaign. Now, at the time, of course, this is immediately meant to add resources to the Clinton campaign because this general wanted them to succeed in the election, which is foreign interference. But further, of course, Americans found out about this happening. And this is the type of thing that can make you question whether or not your elections are really by the people and for the people, or whether there are other influences at play. And I also want to talk about some social media attacks. We're going to talk about ones that really do target that belief system. On the right, you can see an example of a Facebook ad that's meant to make people really to highlight the contrarian opinions and to promote chaos between individuals in the United States. This isn't even an advertisement that's actually sent by someone in the US, by an American. This is sent by another nation in order to really highlight the divides that we have in the country and to make them deeper. On the left-hand side, you can see a Twitter post, a promoted Twitter post that's supposedly from the Clinton campaign. It's very convincing. There's a Hillary Clinton logo in the corner. The colors all match her colors. Of course, she is in the image as well. And it's meant to get eligible voters to text Hillary to a certain number in order to vote. Needless to say, this is not a way that you can vote, but it would be very convincing to people, especially during a pandemic, who don't necessarily want to go wait in line. They'd much rather just text someone and be able to vote. So these are two very important examples of attacks that can make people think that they're able to do something that they're not actually able to do, that can change their perception of their country, and that can, of course, change their perception of their government as well. Now, we've seen over the past few months especially a really, really great approach by social media companies to address the problems that we're seeing with disinformation online. However, I would be remiss not to talk about quotes like these from social media companies and their leaders that really frame this problem as a free speech issue. And I bring this up because I think it's so important throughout this talk to be thinking about the fact that this is not just a social media company problem. This is not just a government problem. This is a problem for each of us to grapple with as individuals and to try to fix as individuals, as parts of our organizations, as parts of the government. However we can, we need to address this problem. And quotes like these muddy the waters and make it seem like this is a free speech issue, when in reality, it is not. This is about making sure that our democracy is safe and protected. And we need to expect people who run our social media companies and who are involved in our critical infrastructure and who work in our government, we need to expect them to protect democracy. Now, I also want to take a look at the information plane. And I think that this is really fascinating because we're going to delve into some very early examples of disinformation. And I want to start with one that's very near and dear to my heart, which is, as an American, which is the foundations of America, which actually comes back to Sam Adams, who is a very popular figure in American history. Now, America, I did not know this, but America was actually founded on the premise of a conspiracy theory where the British were trying to enslave us. Sam Adams argued Britain's taxations were part of an elaborate conspiracy to eventually enslave American colonists. He actually spread that and other early disinformation through pamphlets and speeches that contained information he knew was untrue. And he actually used the Boston Massacre, a very well-known event and inflection point during America's Revolution. He used that to further his message. So we see at this moment, and over the past 4 years, Americans really grappling with this concept of disinformation, and it being very much so tied to social media and the virality and the viral nature of social media. However, this is not a new problem. We've seen this happening for as long as at least the country that I'm in has been around. And honestly, a lot of the countries around the world. And we need to treat it like a people problem, which it is, instead of a social media problem. The next thing I want to talk about is the CIA and the propaganda asset inventory. So during the Cold War era, in the 50s and 60s, of course, the CIA had a large inventory of different propaganda assets across the world. They were very intent on using propaganda to serve their own political and international means. I want to highlight two cases that I think are really interesting and could very easily be made a lot easier through modern day cyber attacks. The first is Radio Free Asia, which was controlled by the CIA and the US government. And the goal with Radio Free Asia was actually to spread the message of propaganda that the CIA wanted to get out to Asian countries. However, they realized that many people in Taiwan, many private citizens at least, would not have access to radios. So they actually strapped radios to balloons and released them into the air, hoping that the wind would take them to Taiwan. Needless to say, the wind went in the wrong direction and they never ended up making it to Taiwan. But it's an interesting example of how constraints during that time really prevented them from spreading propaganda the way that they wanted to, and how you can imagine that with the internet and how we interact now, it would be a lot easier to really get that message to the people in Taiwan or wherever the CIA might be interested in getting it to. The second example I want to give is a magazine called Forum World Features. This magazine had carefully placed propaganda stories in it from the CIA, and it actually became so popular that it was the magazine itself was distributed to the US. So the CIA had to be very careful not to place false stories in the US version. So another example of how logistics can really impact the process and how people go about spreading disinformation. Another example I want to highlight is US radio in Moscow. From 1976 to 1982, rock music like Elton John and the Beatles was really popular, but people in Moscow couldn't get it because it was English. So the CIA actually set up a radio station that made it to Moscow, and they would play rock music, but it was often followed by quote unquote editorial content, which Soviet authorities considered disinformation. I also want to talk about the 2014 elections in Ukraine. So during the 2014 elections, a few days before, on the 21st of May in 2014, the main election network, it's called the CEC network, was compromised, and attackers were actually able to disable vote counting for somewhere around 12 hours. Now, if you're someone who is voting in this election, obviously, this is very concerning, can cause you to immediately lose faith in your government's ability and integrity. But 4 days later, on election day, attacks continued. There was a constant denial of service attack on the CEC website. This is the same website that they compromised and disabled vote counting on. And then 12 minutes before polls closed, attackers posted a picture of the former leader of the right sector on that legitimate website, claiming he won the election. And that was immediately widely shared by Russian media. So this is an interesting combination of a cyber attack used to make something seem legitimate before the polls have even closed, which will automatically make people feel like it's not worth it if they're waiting in line and they see that someone has actually already won the election. Like, why would they bother voting? But it was also immediately shared by Russian media, which tries to really widen the spread of information and make sure that everyone sees, oh, someone has already won the election. If you're thinking about going to the polls, you shouldn't. So a fascinating example of how it can really mess with people's ability to trust results that are posted even on legitimate government websites leading up to an election and during an election. I also want to give some examples from the 2016 US presidential election of communication attacks. So on the right-hand side, you can see an example where an individual is getting a text message from supposedly a government-affiliated organization. It has the actual address of the place that this person is supposed to go vote and gives them more information about hours and all of that. However, this is not an actual polling location. This is a message being sent from an attacker in order to get this person to go somewhere that isn't actually their polling place. Can you imagine? You go out to go vote, you get this text message, you go to this address, and there's nothing there. Are you going to feel frustrated? Maybe not want to go find where you're actually supposed to go vote? Absolutely. On the left, you can also see an example that's supposedly from President Trump saying that this person has not yet submitted their ballot. Now, this message is not from President Trump. It is not from the Trump campaign. It is just meant to shame people into voting. And who knows where that link actually goes. Last but not least are the infrastructure attacks. And these are particularly important to me because really that kinetic impact, that physical impact is where we can see a lot of cyber attacks becoming very serious and potentially having fatal outcomes, which is something that I'm very concerned about. And I want to start with the assassination of Lumumba. Again, this is a historical example. It doesn't have a cyber component, but you can think about how much easier this could be to perpetrate by having a cyber component. So in 1960, the Democratic Republic of the Congo gained independence. That year, they elected a prime minister, Lumumba, and then he was subsequently assassinated 1 year later in 1961. Now, having your leader assassinated as a brand new country would, of course, be politically fracturing for any new and independent nation. But to make things worse, this assassination was actually perpetrated by the American and Belgian governments, all because they wanted to make sure that the leader of the DRC met their Western interests. So imagine you're in a very small country, you're brand new, you choose a leader, and then that leader is assassinated a year later by some of the world's largest superpowers. This is the type of thing that will make you realize that your vote does not matter in this country and that you don't actually control how your country acts. So it not only takes away your belief that your vote actually matters, but it also makes you realize that this isn't really your country. This is a country that's being controlled like a piece of chess, or like a pawn in a chess game. So a very troubling example, and I think a good example that shows the real impact that can come from something like this. The second example that I want to give is the Indonesian elections and subsequent massacre. This was perpetrated in 1965. The Communist Party finished fourth in an Indonesian election, and they were offered a proportional representation in the government there. Now, this was not in keeping with U.S. interests, and so the U.S. secretly supported the purge of suspected communists through many, many messages purporting to be from people within Indonesia, affiliated with Indonesia, but they were Americans. This caused the death of thousands to millions of communists over months, and the military actually took over as the most powerful institution. So this is the type of attack where obviously it kills immediately, but it also terrifies the public. Who is speaking freely? Who is voting freely after this happens in their country, when this huge portion of their government has just been slaughtered for their beliefs? I can't imagine walking around and talking about my belief system or talking about my vote or how I'm excited to vote when something like this happens. So I think this is a really important example, especially because a lot of this was pushed by messages from Americans being sent to Indonesians masquerading as Indonesians. That's particularly important because, of course, with the internet as it is, it's much easier to send messages like that really you can't tell if that person is actually from your country or not. The other example I want to talk about is the Bronze Night. Now, this is not from an election day, but it's a good representation of what could happen and a really modern example. So the Bronze Night was a night in Estonia where Estonians decided to move a Red Army soldier from the center of town to a Soviet cemetery. And this was mainly done because they didn't want a Red Army soldier in the middle of their city, which I think is very understandable. However, fake news immediately began to spread as they did this, with Russian news reports claiming the statue and Soviet war graves were being destroyed. Ultimately, even though this was completely fake, this resulted in 2 nights of riots and looting. 156 people were injured, 1 person died, and 1,000 people were detained. And at the exact same time that all of this was going on, there was a denial of service attack hitting banks, media outlets, and the government in Estonia. People were unable to get cash out of ATMs. They were unable to use online banking. The government employees were unable to communicate through email, and newspapers and broadcasters couldn't deliver the news. So imagine this. You have a bunch of fake information being spread through Russian news reports, and the newspapers can't even report in Estonia whether it's true or not. You have all of this rioting and looting and injury, and government employees, like law enforcement, can't communicate through email. And then, of course, you have a lot of people who may just be trying to get home, and they can't even take out money from ATMs. So this is an example of a multifaceted attack that can cause a lot more chaos and a lot more confusion that can very easily lead to death, and did. To me, this quote is really important because it really highlights how cyber aggression can really create a lot of confusion, but you have a very hard time attributing it to a specific group. And it stays below that level of an armed attack. So the actual response that you're able to give to this type of attack becomes muddy very quickly. Next, I want to talk about attacks on the electric grid. And when we're thinking about this, I want to give an example from 2003 in the United States and Canada, where a 4-day power outage left at least 100 people dead. Now, this is horrifying for obvious reasons, but imagine an attack, a cyber attack perpetrated in this way, and the potential to not only leaving people dead, but to also making people very suspicious as to why that happened. If you have a power outage on election day, you're more likely to be worried about what's in your fridge going bad than you are to be going to vote. You're going to be more worried about your parents and your siblings and anyone in your life, perhaps your children. You're going to be worried about their safety over actually going to vote. These are examples of things that really make people's priorities shift. And I also want to talk about transit, because this one is particularly important. We see this in the United States a lot, whether it's to cause voter suppression or not. If people don't have a way to get to the polls, then they're not going to be able to go vote. So a great example of this is 2016, where San Francisco's transit system was infected with ransomware. Imagine you have your typical day of going to work. I know that I would take the train in. It's a couple of stops. It's maybe a half an hour train ride. And then I work all day. Say that I'm thinking about voting after my work day. I might take my lunch break, scroll through Twitter, maybe see some disinformation, and then close out my work day, go try to get on the train to go home, and go to my polling place and find out that the train has been hit with ransomware and isn't going anywhere. Now, at this point, most people are going to be frustrated and they're just going to want to get home. They've had a long day of work. They're going to be much less concerned with going to vote and much more concerned with having to pay for an Uber instead of just being able to take the train home. These are situations that we need to think about when we're thinking about making sure that people can get to the polls safely and quickly. So we can see that all of these attacks really showcase across all the different layers, both the information and infrastructure and ethos layers, but also each layer of the pyramid itself. And you can think about the fact that these are just examples that are one facet. But imagine if you combined an attack across all three, for example, infrastructure, information, and ethos. If you targeted the belief system at the same time you're targeting people's personal and family health. This is when things start to get more complex and start to get much more dangerous. So let's use this information to dive back into the defender perspective and think about how we can use this to really protect our elections. So where does this leave us? Let's take a look at where we started. A very narrow definition of election security. That's really just about counting the votes, about collecting the votes, about keeping them safe and private, but nothing really else around election security. And this has left us with quotes like these from top diplomats in various countries. We'll have to confront distortions and fake news stories. Quotes from presidents talking about how elections are a scam. Even quotes from top congressional Democrats talking about how we are going to have to deal with amplified disinformation, which these are not necessarily bad quotes. It's just important to note that they don't offer solutions. They don't give us ways to combat this or to work against it. They're just stating the problem without a solution. And this is where the importance lies about having a more comprehensive definition. Because if we don't define what we're trying to fight against, we can't give people solutions. So where should we be going? In my view, and I hope that you share this after this presentation, we need a more comprehensive version of election security that incorporates other elements besides that core base of collecting and counting the votes. This includes the ones that we've talked about today, like communication and social media and transit, but it also includes others. There are lots of forms of critical infrastructure that need to be considered when we are looking to make sure our elections are safe. And in order to understand the full scope of that, I want you to really think about what your election day looks like. Do you vote before work? Do you mail in your ballot? Are you on Twitter? How do modern events change the way that you approach voting and you approach your elections? And then I want you to take that information and think about how you would attack. How would you attack your election day? How would you attack your friend's election day or your parents' election day? What could you do to target each one of these layers? I want you to take that information and use it to understand and figure out how you can actually defend, what you can do to protect democracy, to protect each of these layers. What other layers are missing? What are we not thinking about when it comes to election security that we really should be? And before we go, I want to make sure that we talk about, and I give you some thoughts on what we can really do to protect democracy, because I think it's very important. And so I specifically want to note a couple of core things. The first being secure your systems, whether as an individual or as a business or as a person in government. Just do your best to make sure that your systems are secure. This is critical at all levels, because as we see, these attacks are not just targeting the government. They're targeting all of us. So really work to do your best to secure your systems, to protect your private information, and to make sure that things are more safe. The second, which I highly recommend, is if you are in a position to work with the government. I am personally not in government. I am at a private company. However, I am part of an organization called InfraGard, which is a public-private partnership with the government where we can have communication back and forth that aids both of us. And in the event of a cyber attack, you need to have that open channel of communication already, or you're going to have a lot to do. If you go into election day without an open flow of communication, without the email address that you know you need to contact if something happens, you're going to spend a lot of time running around trying to figure out who the right person is to talk to and how to get to them, as opposed to just being able to communicate the problem immediately and effectively. And that's what we're really looking to achieve, is to build the processes that we need to secure our elections. And the last thing that I will really push for everyone is to just fight disinformation. It's very challenging. I know that it's very easy to retweet something that you believe in because it strikes an emotional chord. But at the end of the day, we all need to do our part to really focus on defense and to think about how we can contribute to fighting disinformation, whether it's online or in person. If you know someone that spreads a lot of disinformation, try to recognize that this is a marathon, not a sprint. You're not going to convince this person right away that they should stop sharing this type of information. But if you are there as a reliable and trusted resource on the truth, not there to shame them, then things will get better. They will start to come about and understand the different perspective on this. And that's the best thing that you can do, is just to be there as someone who they can trust, who they can look up to, who they can communicate with about the things that they're seeing online. If you're interested in the white paper that I wrote about this, which has more information and a lot of what we talked about today, please feel free to download it. It's completely free and it's available at this link. And I want to thank everyone so much for attending this talk. I had a pleasure speaking to you today. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to talk more. You can reach out through email, or also feel free to get in touch with me on Twitter. I'm at HackerBella. And yeah, enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you guys so much again.